Get this started here. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us today for our virtual lunch and learn presentation today on, COVID vaccinations can employers require them, presented by Hinkle Law Firm members Mark McFarland and Michelle Stewart. My name is Abby Stuckey, the events director here at the Chamber. And just really quickly before I pass the torch off to Mark and Michelle, if you have any questions during this webinar today, please feel free to turn your mic on and interrupt during the presentation if it's a timely one, or if you want to submit them in the chat box, we'll address them there as well. So, and I'm also going to put the bios for both Michelle and Mark in the chat box if you're interested in reading those as well. But Mark and Michelle, thank you guys so much for your time today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Abby. I want to thank the Chamber for the opportunity to spend a few minutes with everyone today. We're excited to share our insights and thoughts on this unique and ever evolving and challenging issue facing C-suite execs and HR directors all across the country. Joining me today, I'm going to go to the next slide. Joining me today is one of my partners, Michelle Stewart. You'll see on your screen Michelle's contact information as well as my contact information. Before we get going into the substance of this, there's a few other people I want to recognize. Jim Spencer, who along with Michelle is one of the leaders of our employment law group. I want to thank him for his research efforts in helping us with this presentation. I also want to thank Olivia Rogers. Olivia is a legal intern with us. She's a first-year law student at Notre Dame University Law School, and she took a look at the presentation to make sure that it wasn't too legalese. And so I want to thank her. Actually, tomorrow is Olivia's last day with us, and she's headed back to South Bend. So we've been very happy to have her here with us during her break between semesters. I want to also thank Melissa Smith. She's a marketing director for coordinating this with Ashley and Abby and setting up the PowerPoint presentation for us. And finally, I want to thank the Chamber staff. I think all of you know, if you dealt with the Lenexa Chamber staff, they're second to none, anybody that I've ever dealt with. You know, today, as you know, is Inauguration Day. And I believe this is the first Lunch and Learn of 2021. Is that right, Abby and Ashley? Yeah, okay. So let's think about what the staff just did, okay? Inauguration Day, first Lunch and Learn of 2021. That makes this the inaugural Lunch and Learn for 2021 on Inauguration Day. Now, don't tell me that was a coincidence, okay? These guys don't miss a trick anytime. That was brilliant. So thank you for that. Looks like we have a big turnout today. I was looking through the participants, and Michelle, I know she was too. Looks like there was a lot of familiar names, and we want to thank you for attending. And for those of you that are not familiar with Hinkle, we were founded in 1987 as a business-based planning, transaction, and litigation practice. On your screen, you'll see a sampling of our practice areas. If you want a full list of our practice areas, you can go to www.hinklaw.com and you'll see that. We have approximately 120 legal professionals and support staff members, and we are one of the largest law firms headquartered in the state of Kansas. And we have developed a regional and national presence serving a diverse client base and advice and legal counsel. We have 3 locations in addition to the Kansas City office where Michelle and I both practice out of. We have a Wichita office, and last year we added an office in Topeka to assist our clients with monitoring the legislative session and to promote legislation that's favorable to our clients and business organizations. We represent the Kansas Restaurant Hospitality Association. We represent the Kansas chapter of the Association of General Contractors, and I have a long-standing relationship with the Kansas chapter of the American Council of Engineering Companies. So that helps us help our clients with those particular things. As we have to do, the next slide is a disclaimer, let you know that this is for educational purposes only, and we're not establishing an attorney-client relationship. We would love to establish an attorney-client relationship with you, so if you want to do that, get a hold of us. We'll run conflicts, and assuming we can clear conflicts, then we can have an attorney-client relationship with you. So, Michelle and I talked about how we wanted to do this today, and we want to have an informal, interactive dialogue with all of you that are attending. This is for your benefit, not for ours so much. And the way that Michelle and I operate here in the Kansas City office, which by the way is in the Lenexa City Center. And I want to take an aside on this. We opened up our Kansas City office a little over a decade ago, and Michelle was handpicked to open up the Kansas City office. And under her leadership, over those 10 years or 12 years, however it's been, we've tripled the size of the legal staff and professionals in the Kansas City office. And last year, just literally as the pandemic was being declared, we were finishing the build out and relocating our offices to Lenexa City Center where we currently are. So we're really excited to be part of the thriving business community in Lenexa and part of the Lenexa Chamber.
It's been a welcome breath of fresh air for us. So thank you guys for welcoming us with open arms.
So the way Michelle and I work in our office is a lot of collaboration. I kind of come at things from a business consulting, corporate general counsel perspective. Both of us are business attorneys, but my practice is basically being, advising clients, business clients on a day-to-day basis as things come up. Michelle, although a business lawyer, she comes at it as a perspective as a litigator with the emphasis of employment litigation. So when we come up with these types of things, we usually have a very good dialogue, and we discuss how I see it from a business perspective, how she sees it from a litigation perspective, all at the point of getting to the correct answer on this. So today, we're just going to kind of go with the flow of what we're used to doing between the two of us. And as Abby indicated, certainly don't feel bashful to interrupt us. We're used to that. This is for you. We want to answer your questions. And if you have other questions, then Abby or somebody will see that in the chat room and let us know. So that being said, our goal today is at the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the following two questions. And is, can employers mandate employees receive the COVID-19 vaccination? And if employers can, should employers mandate employees to receive the COVID-19 vaccination? So,
and the caveat being too, this could all change tomorrow because these are, unfortunately, employment law in general is this gray area because it's one of those areas of law that there is no black and white. It's not like, hey, you went over the speed limit or you rear-ended a car. Those are laws, and we can say, hey, gosh, that's probably your fault. Employment law is the mythical gray area, and you can go down lots of rabbit holes. This one is particularly unique because it has never happened before. There is no precedent. You can't go to a statute or a court decision or guidance from someone and say, yeah, this is probably what's going to happen. So if you do X, Y, and Z, you're probably going to be okay. So, we're giving you kind of the best advice and the advice that we are giving clients about these ever-changing fluid situations. Because again, this is something we've never seen before. So we hope that it is something that we will be able to answer your questions as thoughtfully as we can.
Hey, Michelle and Mark, really quick.
Yeah.
We're having some audio issues. One of the members just said they were having a hard time hearing. So if you wouldn't mind, if there's any way you can move a little closer to the microphone, that would be great. If you can, and again, it's just.
Yeah, we'll do the best we can.
Okay,
Thank
you so much.
I got kicked off, so that probably was a problem for me. So I'm back on now. Okay. Well, the first question is, can employers mandate employees receive the COVID-19 vaccination? I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because most of you are probably smart enough to figure out that if the next question is, should employers mandate employees receive the COVID-19 vaccination? You probably know what you think the answer is to the first question. And you might be a little bit surprised, but we do want to go through kind of a little bit of analysis to answer that question, so that at the end of this part of the presentation, you'll have a better understanding of why our answer is what it is. Historically, employers that have mandated vaccination programs have been limited to healthcare and educational environments for obvious reasons.
And a lot of law enforcement, first responders as well. So that's, that's a big area too, is whether police departments and fire departments can mandate. And historically, yes, the best guidance is going to the H1N1 outbreak, and whether or not those individuals were mandated, were required to get the vaccine.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about that a little later. Right now, there are no reported cases interpreting any law that's on the books that says that it is per se unlawful for an employer to mandate a vaccination policy. By the same token, there are no reported cases that are interpreting any existing law that says that it is permissible for an employer to do it. So there's nothing out there that says yes you can or no you can't on an absolute basis. So but what we do know is that there are several federal and state laws that could be implicated if you decide to mandate a vaccination policy. So what we want to do is we want to go over some of those as we go along. We got the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have Title VII, we have Osha and the National Labor Relations Act as a few, and then we also have the Kansas Act Against Discrimination, which would be your local your state counterpart to the Title VII. Under the ADA does not say per se that having a mandatory vaccination policy is unlawful. You have to meet certain conditions, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, and you may need to accommodate employees to do that. The EEOC is the authority that issues guidance on issues involving the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what the EEOC has said is under the ADA, an employer cannot have a testing protocol procedure to determine whether or not an employee has a disability. And what the EEOC has said last month is that having a vaccination policy does not meet a medical examination, and therefore it is not specifically prohibited by the ADA. Now, there's a caveat on that, as Michelle was indicating, there's nothing black and white in employment law, especially with an area like this that's new and unique and uncharted. To get to giving a vaccination, healthcare providers have to ask pre-screening vaccination questions. And that can be a disability question that would be prohibited by the ADA. So you have to be very careful, and we'll talk about this again a little bit later, about mandating a vaccination policy with a healthcare provider that you're going to tell your employees they have to go use to do that, because then at that point in time, those healthcare providers are going to be asking these pre-screening vaccination questions, and then might put you in jeopardy of being in violation of the ADA. On your screen, I put a link to the EEOC guidance. We'll let you know that although it is highly influential, it's not binding on any of the courts of law. It's kind of a long website, so if you don't get a chance to get that all written down, just email Michelle or I, and we'll send you the link to that.
And as with everything from the EEOC, I was telling Abby yesterday, it reads a lot like stereo instructions. It's as clear as mud. So it's one of those guidances that goes back and forth and says, you can do these things. But if you're going to ask medical questions that would per se lead to identification of a disability, it can come back to haunt you as, if you happen to have to terminate an employee or have to let an employee go for any other reason. Well, but you perceived me as disabled because I answered yes to these screening questions. So that's where you get into the nuances of when you mandate something and then you're asking questions that could lead to answers that would potentially be a disability or could be regarded as a disability. The allegation may then be, you have this information, you let me go, even though it's a performance issue, or it's a, we're reducing staff, or you're part of a RIF, whatever. It may be, well, you regarded me as disabled because I answered yes to this question. And so because you regarded me as disabled, that's why I lost my position, not necessarily because, you know, I was a bad employee. So that's the catch to mandating those types of things.
Those are great points. The next federal law that could be implicated if you mandate a vaccination policy is Title VII, which is our basic anti-discrimination federal law. As we were talking about earlier, the state counterpart to that would be the Kansas Act Against Discrimination. And it's a complete another presentation to determine whether or not you as the employer are subject to Title VII or the ADA or Osha or any of these, or the Kansas Act Against Discrimination. Most of you probably already know that. We're not going to go into the prerequisites and the thresholds to determine whether or not your particular corporation business is subject to Title VII or the Kansas Act Against Discrimination. Just understand that if you're not subject to Title VII, you're probably going to be subject to the Kansas Act Against Discrimination if you're in Kansas, and
they're very similar.
They're very similar, and so the court opinions interpreting Title VII will be precedent in determining whether or not you violated the Kansas Act Against Discrimination.
So the main focus on the vaccine has been religious accommodations. So your employee comes to you and says, you know, I have a firmly held religious belief that prevents me from having these vaccines. You know, can you tell them, sorry, we're mandating it. This is our policy. And one thing that's important on religious accommodations, and it kind of goes across the board, not limited to vaccines, is whether or not that is a sincerely held religious belief and it's a tenet of the religion. And when you're going down that rabbit hole, there are a lot of religions that a lot of people may think, I've never heard of that religion before. You found it on the internet. I don't even know what those tenets are. And we get into this a lot with prisoners. You know, they come up with, well, I have this religious belief, and so this is my tenet. But you have to be very careful because the courts on religious accommodations are they have a wide interpretation of what a religious accommodation is and whether that's a sincerely held religious belief. I mean, we're not talking only limited to traditional Judeo-Christian, Jewish, you know, I mean, the religions that everyone is very familiar with. So it's best when we're talking about if someone comes to you with saying, I can't do this because it's against my religion, that you start with the assumption that it is a tenet of their religion and then go through the analysis then going forward.
Yeah, great points. Let's talk about OSHA real quick. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration has not taken an official position one way or the other with regards to the COVID-19 vaccination. However, it's important to note that OSHA did previously approve the mandate of the flu vaccine during the H1N1 situation back, I think, in 2009 or something like that. The difference that I would point out between the H1N1 vaccine and the COVID-19 vaccine situations is the H1N1 vaccine was fully approved by CDC and the FDA at the time that it was being administered. As you probably are all aware, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines that are currently being distributed are being authorized under emergency use authorization, which is much less than being fully approved. And so one of the issues is going to be whether or not that's a significant difference. And I think it is, because in Kansas, unless you have an employee that has a written contract of employment for a specific duration period of time, they're considered at-will employees, and they can be terminated for no reason or for cause, as long as that cause does not violate public policy. And the link that I have up here to the CVD vaccine is to the fact sheets that go out with the Pfizer vaccination to the healthcare providers, and that are also supposed to be given to the people that are going to receive the vaccine. And those fact sheets specifically state that because this is essentially emergency use authorization or experimental vaccine at this point in time, that a recipient has the absolute right to refuse to accept the vaccine. And so the argument would be, from the employee standpoint, that if I refuse to take the Pfizer vaccine because it's an experimental use authorization, and you, the employer, take adverse action against my employment, then you have breached my employment at will, because you have taken adverse action against me in violation of me exercising a public policy and a right to be able to refuse that. So that's really, really important distinction between the H1N1 situation, 13 years ago, 12 years ago, and the current situation we have. And so under the Occupational Safety and Health Administration rules and regulations, I think the best advice is you need to carefully investigate the medical and safety objections that the employee is giving you before you make a decision to mandate the vaccination under the OSHA regulations.
And the other thing that OSHA has done during the pandemic, though, is taken the position that its general overarching theme that employers are required to provide a safe workplace, and used that to say, well, then you can mandate mask wearing, you can mandate, people who deal with, for example, banks, if you're dealing with money, you may mandate glove usage or different various personal protection devices, because OSHA requires you to provide a safe workplace. And so that's going to be, OSHA is going to have to make a decision at some point, probably in the next few months, as to whether either having the vaccine or not having the vaccine is a requirement for making a safe workplace. But right now they're taking the position that a vaccine isn't required to meet that obligation under OSHA to provide a safe working environment for your employees.
Yeah, another good point, Michelle. Thank you. Let's go to the National Labor Relations Act. This is probably not going to apply to most of you, because this really applies, generally speaking, to unionized employers. And so if you have a unionized employment or unionized employees, then you're probably subject to a collective bargaining agreement. And if you have a collective bargaining agreement with the union, then whether or not you can mandate a vaccination policy is going to be addressed, I'm pretty sure, in that collective bargaining agreement. So you will need to take a look at that to see if that prohibits you in any way from doing it. The other thing to take away from, if you are subject to the NLRA, is that employees are permitted to publicly discuss, protest, and even oppose a mandatory program. And so you cannot take adverse action against a unionized employee if they want to publicly object to or oppose a mandatory vaccination policy, or actually any other mandatory program for that matter, because that would be a violation of the NLRA. So the takeaway from this first part, and I told you, you probably already know what the answer is, but this may be a little different than what you thought. Most commentators are saying that yes, you can do it. we're taking the position that, well, maybe you can, based upon the discussions that we've had before, with the ADA and Osha and Title VII and NLRA. But the real question is, and what we really want to spend some time on this afternoon with you is, should you require a mandatory vaccination program? So that's what we're going to talk about next.
And this is the million-dollar question. You probably can do it and not be in trouble. But the should is where we're all going to find ourselves in either trouble or not trouble. And that's where all of these laws that we've kind of briefly gone over come into play. Because each company is going to make their own decision, and they are allowed to do that. And you can't say, you have an employee come in and say, well, Bank A is making everyone have the vaccine, and I work at Bank B. Why don't we have that same policy? It's not a nationwide, at least today, there is no nationwide vaccine mandate. It is not it's not a federal, state, local law that everyone has to be vaccinated. Everyone has to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. So, there are two, I think, factors that go into whether a business or entity should mandate all of its employees having the vaccine. And it's, not only is it a legal question, but it's a practical question as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, because the legal implications are probably more from a litigation standpoint than they are from me advising my clients on a day-to-day basis. And I'll probably take the lead on the practical considerations. So Michelle, why don't you go ahead and talk about the legal implications in federal and state laws and any other implications there might be.
So whenever you're dealing with employees, there are a myriad of discrimination laws that everyone has to be aware of, and everybody already is. You can't fire someone because of their age, their gender, their race, their nationality, if they are pregnant. All of those things that we all know as businesses that, hey, you can't do it. That can't be a consideration factor. But when you're talking about saying, okay, well, hey, I have a policy that I'm going to mandate all of our employees receive the vaccine or they can't come back to work, then that goes into the consideration. Okay, so I have, 10 employees who are pregnant, who, based on the research today, they are not allowed to receive the vaccine. They cannot receive it until after they have given birth. And so then are you discriminating against them by not allowing them to come back to a workplace because they haven't received the vaccine? The same thing goes for employees who have a disability. So if somebody has a disability that qualifies under the ADA, that disability prevents them from receiving the vaccine, but they can otherwise do their job, then you have to say, okay, well, so what are our accommodations? Just like any other ADA claim. Okay, so I'm disabled, I can't, lift over 100 pounds, but I can do these jobs. Okay, so can you accommodate them without receiving the vaccine? Can they be allowed to work in an office with the door shut? Can they be allowed to work remotely because they can't receive the vaccine? The safety-based standard has to apply as to whether or not you can tell them, yeah, you know what, if you don't get the vaccine because of whatever reason, we can't have you come back because you are at risk or you are putting other people at risk. But it's got to be a very detailed determination before you say that, because whether or not you are, the ADA may trump any sort of mandatory vaccine. And again, we don't know because there's no law, there's no litigation, there's no case law that we can say, yes, we understand the ADA and we understand that, you can give X accommodations, but not allowing the vaccine isn't a reasonable accommodation, because courts may find, you know what, you don't mandate the flu vaccine and you allow people to come back. So, this disabled person, or this person who cannot receive the vaccine, a reasonable accommodation may be that they don't have to, they're exempted from getting the vaccine. It again goes back to what everyone does on a regular basis when you're dealing with disability claims, is it's individual. You have to, the EEOC has set out the factors when you have to look at whether that person not being vaccinated poses a direct threat to other employees, whether there is a direct threat to them for not receiving the vaccine, nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood the potential harm will actually occur, and the imminence of the harm. Again, it goes back to, and I think this will be overarching throughout the, should you do it, should you have a policy, is if you make a policy, you have to stick to it. And this is why, just in general, blanket policies that say this has to happen for everyone, a lot of times come back to bite us, because we have to say, okay, yeah, there's this mandatory policy, but then, my best employee, Jane Smith comes to me and says, I can't do this because of X, Y, and Z. And you say, well, gosh, I can't lose Jane. So, I'm going to let her not get vaccinated, because, I get it. She can't be vaccinated. And then
my problem
fast forward,
employee, that I've been wanting to get rid of, try to find a reason to do it, has the same X, Y, Z. And I say, okay, you're out of here. You're going to be looking at a disparate treatment claim, coming your way for sure. I think to add on to what Michelle was talking about, we have these factors, okay? And so you can evaluate them, but they're really not objective factors. There's a lot of subjectivity in them. And so how you administer them, how you enforce them is going to take a lot of discretion on your part as the employer. And when that starts happening, then your risk of receiving a lawsuit for how you exercise your discretion starts growing and growing and growing. And when you add that in the general nature of discrimination and ADA and apply that to this emerging situation that we have no case law on, it's uncharted, we have guidance, but the guidance is not absolutely clear. If you're the risk manager, HR director, or C-suite exec on this, you got big issues in evaluating that, how much risk you want to put your business at for having a mandatory policy.
Well, and the courts just on ADA have been very, they keep getting further and further into, well, having an extended leave. Letting them take more time off. Maybe it's unpaid, but you leave their job open. Maybe that's a reasonable accommodation. So maybe, you have to work harder to let that employee work remotely, or you have to definitely show that employee, whatever they do, their job function cannot be done away from others, cannot be done remotely, you have to go through all those factors, because the courts more and more just on general ADA accommodation issues have been leaning towards allowing more time off and more flexibility for employees. And so the employer really bears a lot of the burden of showing we can't function, our business cannot function by not having this person working in the office, on a factory line, on whatever they're doing. And so it is not reasonable or feasible, or we don't have the ability to allow that accommodation, because we cannot accommodate that. It just does not accommodate for our business and in being able to run our business.
Mark and Michelle, can you address sort of on the flip side, what to do about an employee who says that they don't want to come back to work unless they don't feel safe coming back to work unless everybody at work is vaccinated, which is sort of a different side of the same coin.
Yeah, that's the 180 of what we've been talking about. And from a practical standpoint, that's what my business clients, they're asking that question more than they're asking some of these other questions, is how do we do that? And, the answer to that question is, I'm not really sure. Because again, even though it's an uncharted territory on whether you can mandate these things and make accommodations, it's even another step further away when you're applying it in reverse on this. And I think the best advice, at least that I've come up with, that I can give my clients, and Michelle and I really haven't bounced this off each other too much from her standpoint, from the litigation standpoint, is I'll go back to what Michelle was talking about with OSHA. If you're subject to OSHA, you have an obligation to make the workplace safe. And if under the evaluation that you do of your particular business, in order to make your business safe and compliant with OSHA, you have to have a mandatory policy, then you got to do that. And then if somebody can't do it because they have a disability, or we'll talk about in a little bit, a sincerely held religious belief, then I think the same applies to the person who says, I'm not going to come back unless everybody's vaccinated. I think you have to make a reasonable accommodation to them. And is that, is your business where they have offices that have ceilings and walls and doors, or are you an architect or engineer where you work in a more open environment and those types of things? So, that's a real balancing act. And so, if you have a mandatory policy, I think that's going to cause you more issues than if you don't have a mandatory policy. I don't know what you think about that, Michelle.
Yeah, so, and it's come up, it even came up really when we were dealing with just the pandemic in general. What if you have an employee who's like, I am so afraid of catching this that I refuse to leave my house. I don't care what you've done to the office. You can fumigate it every day and have, it wiped down. I don't want to come back. I'm scared. And unfortunately, being scared of coming back to work really is not been seen, at least under the DOL and the EEOC guidance that we've received, starting in March of last year. That's not a disability. That is not a religious belief. That is not something that you have to technically accommodate for. You may want to, because this may be, again, the star employee of your show. But again, it goes back to if you have a policy that you're going to tell people, you got to come back. And I mean, we're not having a mandatory vaccination policy, but we have taken these 5 to 10 steps to make this a safe environment. We require masks. We require sanitizing everything once you touch it. I had this come up for a client who runs multiple banks throughout the state of Kansas and Colorado. And, we had, we said, here are our, this is how we have made the environment safe. We will provide the masks. We provide the air purifiers. We provide these things. And because we're providing those, we have met the safe, making a safe working environment. And I understand and appreciate that you are fearful. We're all fearful, but in order to operate our business, we have to have you come back to work, because in situations like that, you got to tell her, people that actually have to be there that cannot be remote. And once that's been explained to employees, it has generally been, okay, well then I guess I'm coming back to work. And we haven't had any issues, but we're going to have issues. It's going to come up and it's going to happen. But again, dealing with it across the board in the same manner is the best advice that I can always give people, because it's going to save you from litigating, because you're not applying one standard to one person and allowing someone to say, well, you didn't let me do that because of X, Y, and Z, protected factor.
Yeah, before we move on from, what do you do if you have an employee that refuses to get the vaccination or can't do it because of a disability? Two other issues that are going to come up in your business is going to be making sure that your managers and your supervisors, or whoever the person is that's responsible for communicating with employees about compliance with the vaccination policy or with the discrimination laws, is make sure that those people understand and can recognize what an accommodation request looks like. Because it's not necessarily, hey, can I have the accommodation request form and fill it out and do those types of things? It can come by way of a lot of different ways. And so your managers and supervisors need to be aware of when an accommodation request is being made by an employee, because if an accommodation request is made and they don't do that, then you're going to be at potential liability. And so that's very, very key that that type of personnel understands that. And then once you made a decision and you can reasonably accommodate an employee, you have to remember, you got to tell your people they can't. It's unlawful to disclose to other employees or other people in general that you provided a reasonable accommodation to an employee, because then all of a sudden they're going to have the stigma of having a disability or whatever it might be. So I don't know what happened to.
I don't know why. I don't know why I have a white box there.
There we go. Perfect. So the next question.
I've got one other thing to pose in here, and it may have already been answered, but we had a question come in that said, what about employees who refuse to take the vaccine, but the business is classified as an essential industry? They can't be accommodated, quote, forever, i.e. like working from home, things like that, because an on-site physical presence is part of their daily duties. And then again, it has nothing to do with religious reasons or a medical exemption, just flat out objection to it.
Right. And that's going to come up because, unfortunately, as with a lot of things, the vaccine has become politicized. People are, fearful that, gosh, am I going to hear one of those commercials in 10 years? Were you vaccinated between, 2020 and 2021? You too may be entitled to compensation. I mean, so we've had this, it's unfortunately been politicized, and so people are concerned just about getting the vaccine because, hey, I don't know where it came from. I don't know, maybe this got rushed through, maybe this isn't, as Mark said, it hasn't been fully approved and vetted by the FDA. It didn't go through years and years of testing to make sure it was safe. Unfortunately, if it goes both ways. If you have a mandatory vaccine policy because they are essential and they flat out refuse, then that has to be a point where you're going to have to make the hard decision to say, then unfortunately we can't continue to employ you. And it's tough, it's unfortunate, it is not what anyone, nobody who owns a business or goes into business says, you know what, the best part of my day is when I get to fire people. No, it's the absolute worst, and you agonize over it. But when you're faced with those situations where it is an essential function, you have a policy that is mandatory vaccinations, then that is going to, and you can't accommodate anything that is reasonable or otherwise, then that is the point where you have to have a serious conversation and explain that because we are, requiring this, and you do not have, it's not a disability, it's not a religious accommodation, it's not anything, then either we're gonna, you're gonna get the vaccine, or we're gonna have to end our employment relationship.
Yeah, remember, under the ADA, your obligation as an employer who's somebody who, if you have mandatory policy and they can't do it because of a disability, is to make a reasonable accommodation, not all accommodations. And if there are no reasonable accommodations that can be made that don't impose an undue burden on the employer, then you don't have to make that accommodation. It's no longer reasonable because it's an undue burden on you as the employer. But one of my comments later on, I'll just go ahead and make it now, is if you like talking to lawyers and you like paying legal bills, then you probably should have a mandatory vaccination policy, because I can pretty much guarantee you, if you have one, you're going to face some type of litigation from any of these issues that we've already talked about, because somebody who can't do it and they get adverse employment action taken against them, or somebody, as Ashley said, somebody won't come back to work because not everybody else is getting vaccinated, and so then you got to take adverse action with them. And that's kind of the takeaway, I guess, to kind of jump ahead is, if you're going to have a mandatory vaccination policy, then be prepared to be talking to Michelle and I or some other lawyer and paying legal fees until we get some clearer guidance from the courts on how this is going to be taken care of.
And they had one. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Just real quick, I think, Michelle, you already talked about that. Before we get to the practical implications, I know we're getting close to running out of time, and we'll buzz through those, but is there anything you want to add to if an employee refuses the vaccination because of a sincerely held religious belief that you didn't discuss earlier?
No, I kind of covered that, and I was going to go into a little bit more detail, but I think we all get the gist of employment issues and religious accommodation. If the employee comes to you and says, this is an undue hardship for me, I can't do this because of my religious beliefs, the employer has to engage in that dialogue with the employee. Okay, so can this be accommodated? Can you, is it okay to say, I understand you cannot get vaccinated. Here are some, here are the risks. If you go into the workplace and you have not received the vaccine, you might get sick. I mean, you have to know those. And they say, okay, you know what, look, I'm not getting vaccinated because of my religious belief. The employer can't force, I mean, if this is because of religion, you can't force them to do it. But if you then engage in that dialogue and say, well, you are, by not getting vaccinated, placing other people at risk, then again, it goes back to, can you accommodate them? Can you put them into a different position? Can you put them in an isolated area? Can you put them into a remote working situation only? But it again goes back to, just as similar to the disability, can that, is the accommodation reasonable? But you can't force them. I mean, you can't say, I'm going to go against your religious belief and mandate that you have the vaccine. But again, if you have that policy that's mandating the vaccine and you say, well, you're not going to get it, I understand, but then we don't have anything for you, that can accommodate your, sincerely held religious belief about not getting the vaccine. So, we've done all we can. We have talked with you. We have interacted with you to try to figure out if there are alternatives, to try to figure out whether there's a reasonable accommodation. Again, it doesn't automatically mean you terminate them, but it does mean that, if that person has a job function that can't be reasonably accommodated to the, otherwise it would be detrimental to the business. Again, these choices are not easy or fun, but at the end of the day, it's, can the business survive by allowing these things to happen? And if it can't, then that is time to thank them for their service and say that you're going to have to part ways.
Michelle, before you move on your last slide, I just wanted to, you mentioned workers' comp. Do you want to talk about whether this potentially could have workers' compensation implications?
Yeah, I was getting ready to go there because we talked about the ADA and Title VII and KAD, but the workers' compensation is an issue. We know that a certain percentage of the population is going to have side effects from the Pfizer or Moderna vaccination. We've already seen it, okay? That's going to happen. So if you have a mandatory policy, a vaccination policy, and an employee goes and gets that vaccination because it's required and has some side effects, then I think there's a real risk that that will be considered to be an injury arising out of in the course and scope of your employment, and then they would have a workers' compensation claim. And so then you're talking about providing medical treatment, and you're talking about potentially providing temporary partial or temporary total disability, and maybe even some potential permanent partial or permanent total disability as a result of that. And what we don't know is, even if that is a workers' compensation claim, what does your workers' compensation insurance policy provide in the way of coverage? And would this be covered? And so I think, it's kind of a legal, practical, hybrid question is, before you require or make the decision to require a mandatory vaccination policy, you need to take a look at your insurance policy, talk to your insurance broker or insurance agent and say, show me in my policy that if the employee gets side effects from this, that I have workers' compensation coverage for that. So I think that's a very important thing to take a look at. So let's go on to the practical implications. And I know we got just a few more minutes to go, but I wanted to go over these real quick. We know, it's reported that approximately 42% of the population is hesitant to take either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccination. And there's for several reasons for that: how fast the vaccine was developed, how short the testing period was, the fact that it's under emergency use authorization as opposed to being fully approved. And then we just talked about the fear of the side effects. But people also have, philosophical opposition to vaccinations in general. And as Michelle discussed earlier, this has been politicized to some extent, and there are genuine disagreements between people over the risk posed by the COVID-19 vaccination. We see it all the time. I mean, there's people that, swear that this is, the worst thing that ever happened. And there's other people who are like, there's nothing here. And, we can't resolve that question. All we can do is say, you know what, there are disagreements to that. And so when you get a mandatory vaccination policy, you're putting yourself, your business, square in the middle of that argument. And do you really want to do that? And then the last thing is, there are a lot of large employers. I can think of Walmart, I think maybe Ford Motor Company, who have elected not to implement a mandatory policy. So then, as Michelle was talking about earlier, Bank A has a policy, Bank B doesn't. Well, when the big boys and girls don't have one, the rest of us that have smaller businesses are going to have a much more difficult time convincing our employees that we need to have one, or we should have one. We talked about the employees who refuse to return to work unless everyone is vaccinated. Let's talk about the discipline and enforcement. What are you going to do if somebody has to be absent from work due to the side effects from the vaccine? Is that going to be excused? Is that going to be paid? How are you going to enforce that? There's a cost associated with that too. And do you really have the chutzpah to terminate a discharged employee who refuses to get vaccinated? And I think one of the business considerations you have to look at is, so you go ahead and do that. How quickly can you replace that employee? How efficiently can you replace that employee so that your business can continue to go? I think that's a real practical implication that you have to consider before you implement a mandatory vaccination policy.
Or if you say it's mandatory and 10 of your employees say, we're not doing it. Yeah. Then you're like, okay, well, so that means that I either have no business and I have to close my doors, or I have to rethink my policy. That's why the mandatory, bright line policies about vaccinations it's problematic, just from a lot of perspectives, not only administrative burden and discipline and enforcement, but just, okay, so I made this policy and now I have to enforce it. And maybe I didn't think about everything that was going to happen if I actually had to enforce it. And then you may want to apply that selectively. I mean, it kind of is just one of those, it goes back to having mandatory policies in general in your office, because it's kind of one of those, oh crap, now I just got rid of all my good people. And all these bad people decided they were going to do the vaccine. Here I am.
It's always great to have policies and rules, but the downside of that is then there's an administrative cost to enforcing those and doing that. And one of the things, with regard, we talked about accommodation. And so I think we've already said, that's a pretty fact-intensive, time-consuming process. So if you're going to have a mandatory policy, you're probably going to have accommodation requests. Do you have the time and the personnel to do the fact investigation and the time consumption associated with determining what that accommodation is or getting a reasonable accommodation? You got to verify and you got to document all of the employees' vaccinations. You got all kinds of record keeping protocols. We talked about the discipline, and then you have the confidentiality issue if you do that.
And you also have the other employee going, well, Bob got to work from home, and why do I have to come into the office? That's not fair. I think he's just watching Netflix. So, and you can't discuss that. You can't discuss that Bob has, a religion that prevents him from doing this. So that's why Bob's working from home. So that's a cost and administrative burden as well.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, I think the takeaway from this second question is, should you have one, is I think Michelle and I would both, and I know that I have, and I'm pretty sure she has counseled her clients already, is, instead of having a mandatory policy, why don't you consider encouraging and facilitating the employee vaccination rather than mandating it? It sure takes off a lot of all of those practical considerations and starts to narrow back down this risk. And so if you're the risk manager, you want to keep that risk as manageable as possible. And so I think that's probably the best advice that we would give, at least at this point in time. Again, understanding, later on this afternoon, there may be executive orders that are issued, or tomorrow, whatever, and you can change all of these types of things. So.
And it's another thing too, another option maybe to provide, an incentive for getting the vaccine, or, saying, okay, well, so if you do get the vaccine and you suffer symptoms, we will, or suffer complications, then we will pay time off, because all of that emergency sick leave, emergency FMLA sunsetted in December 31st of 2020. And, you can voluntarily extend those through March 31st, but that guarantee, that mandate that everyone has to do it. And so, rather than making a hard line, everyone has to do this, it may be more of an incentive based that, here, we're giving you paid time off to go get the vaccine or to recover from it, any potential side effects, versus having to take your vacation or PTO.
And one more thing, and I know we're over time, but I'll make this as short as I possibly can, is, I want to go over this question is, requiring proof of receipt of the COVID vaccine if you decide to have a mandatory policy. Requesting proof of it is not prohibited, but if the employee does not provide it, do not ask the employee why, because if that happens to be a disability reason or a sincerely held religious belief, you're going to be in a world of trouble under the ADA and Title VII to do that. So then, the last slide is, so you want to implement a vaccination policy, what are your next steps? Well, there are a lot of factors you should consider. We talked about a bunch of those today, but if you want to do that and you think that's where you want to go, there's our contact information, and we'd be glad to talk to you about that. That's all I got. Michelle, you got anything else?
Yep. No, I apologize for going over time. It just impacts a lot of different things, and I know there's a lot of questions out there. And again, if you have follow-up questions, please reach out. you know, this is kind of, it's a fluid situation, but we're all doing the best we can. And so far, there's been a lot of lenience as far as from the DOL and the EEOC as to employers struggling with what do we do. But
That's
thank
it.
you very much
Yeah,
for
thank
your
you.
time. Thank you to the chamber for letting us take up your lunch, and appreciate it.
All right. Well, everyone, I think all the questions that I had come through the chat were answered. And so I'm just seeing a lot of thanks again for the great information. Michelle and Mark, thank you guys for taking your time today to share, again, a fluid situation as to, again, COVID vaccinations and in the employer world. So if you guys have any questions, feel free. I know Michelle and Mark have their email addresses up there. But we, again, thank you guys for your continued support. We hope everybody is staying safe and healthy, and we will see you all soon. But again, thank you, Michelle and Mark, and have a great day, everyone.